Good day. The last night, the last 24 hours, in terms of military activity in the Ukraine conflict, have basically preserved the so-called pause in the offensive which has been underway since the middle of June. I say pause, though, as we will see, it's not really a pause at all. Heavy fighting continues every single day. But nonetheless, in terms of movements of troops, advances on front lines, dramatic events, well, there's been little of that to speak of. At the same time, despite the fact that this offensive, this Ukrainian offensive, over the last 24 hours has continued to be in a state of pause, inverted commas, last night was one of the tensest and most intense days of the entire conflict. And the reason this was the case was because throughout the hours preceding the night, there were multiple rumours of an immense incident about to take place relating to the Zaporozhzhye nuclear power plant. A few hours before evening fell, a Russian official connected with Rosatom, I believe, that's the Russian agency that deals with nuclear power questions, said that there was a Ukrainian plan to launch a strike on the Zaporozhzhye nuclear power plant. This would take the form of a missile strike with a Tochka-U missile, which would be equipped with a warhead that had radioactive material. The intention being to create, if not an incident actually involving the power plant itself, at least the appearance of one, an appearance of an incident which would result in radioactive contamination. And there was this created an immense amount of tension, lots of claims, concerns that over the course of the night there would be some kind of Ukrainian attack on the Zaporozhzhye nuclear power plant. Now, that was the story that was circulating in Russia. In Ukraine, it was the same, but from the diametrically opposite position. And here, it was actually not just officials, like the official of, I believe, Rosatom, who spoke in that way. This time, it was actual political leaders. President Zelensky has been relentlessly plugging the story that some major strike by the Russians on the Zaporozhzhye nuclear power plant is about to take place. Ukrainian media reports and official reports have claimed that the Russians have been evacuating their personnel from the Zaporozhzhye nuclear power plant in anticipation of some big incident there. President Zelensky, or at least his officials, have claimed that the Russians have mined the power plant in some fashion, or that they've placed mines on the roof of the power plant. Lots of claims of that nature. And again, the story was that last night some kind of major explosion would take place, again dispersing radioactive contamination across a lot of the battlefield area. And there was talk again that this would affect places like Dnipro, the city of Dnipro, where the governor has been conducting all kinds of exercises to prepare people for an incident of that nature, supposedly hatched by the Russians. And anyway, all of these claims and rumours came together with last night being identified as the moment that something like this would happen. Except that it didn't. The night passed quietly. There was no attack on the Zaporozhzhye nuclear power plant over the course of the night. No explosion by the Russians. No missile attack by the Ukrainians. Both sides, of course, have heatedly denied that they have any intention of causing any kind of damage to the nuclear power plant. And anyway, morning came and the nuclear power plant is there, and for the moment the situation around it remains calm. Now, there are other rumours now circulating, and I want to stress at the moment that I treat these purely as rumours. The rumours, for example, include claims that over the course of yesterday and last night, various unnamed European officials contacted the authorities in Kiev and pressed them to avoid or not to undertake some kind of incident with the Zaporozhzhye nuclear power plant, and the officials in Kiev, who may have included Zelensky himself, agreed to that. That's a rumour. Now that, of course, is a rumour that originates from Russian, or at any rate pro-Russian sources. I want to stress it's a rumour. I have no evidence at all to confirm it. I've seen no readouts that tell us that any European officials or European leaders were indeed in touch with anybody in Ukraine over any of this. But anyway, that's just one example of a rumour which has been circulating. So what is actually going on? What is actually going to happen? Now, as I've said many times, I am not an expert on many things, and one of the things I am not an expert on is the structure, the construction of nuclear power plants. However, I understand that the Zaporozhzhye nuclear power plant, which is built by the Soviet Union, was one of the Soviet Union's most modern and most well-constructed and well-designed nuclear power plants. And that's perhaps understating things. The Soviets actually had outstanding nuclear engineers. I've also said many times that when it came to infrastructure construction, the Soviets always over-engineered the buildings that they were constructed. We've seen that with the bridges across the Dnieper, the power stations that were attacked in Ukraine over the course of the winter, and of course we see it with the nuclear power plant at Zaporozhye. And I've also read that the design of the power plant was completely different from the design of the power plant at Chernobyl, where a famous or notorious incident took place in the 1980s, in 1986. And it seems that the nature of the reactors in the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant is completely different. They are much smaller than the Chernobyl reactor. They are housed in extremely solid and very powerful concrete shells. It seems that just lobbing a missile at this nuclear power plant would do little in the way of damage, at least to the nuclear reactors. It's been suggested that the places where the spent nuclear fuel is stored might be more vulnerable, but again, there's clear evidence that since last year, the Russians have taken protective steps to protect these containment buildings. And to be straightforward about it, an attack on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant is most unlikely to result in any kind of incident itself. It would not result in a repeat of the Chernobyl affair. It would not result in massive contamination, enormous damage, anything of that nature. And by the way, a number of people have made points that in fact there have been incidents when nuclear power plants have been attacked in the past over the course of military conflicts. A lot of talk, for example, about the attack in 1981 by Israel of the Osirak nuclear reactor in Iraq. The Israelis launched that attack as part of what they said at the time was an attempt to prevent Iraq developing a nuclear bomb. By the way, there's no doubt at all that in the years after the Israeli attack on the Osirak reactor, Saddam Hussein's government did indeed engage in a major development program that almost resulted in Iraq acquiring a nuclear bomb. But I've been told by several people, something I can never confirm, that the Oz-Iraq reactor had never played any role in any of that, and that was indeed a civilian facility. But anyway, my understanding is that the Oz-Iraq reactor was much smaller than the Zaporozhzhye nuclear power plant. I'm not even entirely sure whether it was fully operational at the time of the Israeli attack. I don't think one should make too many close analogies between that attack and whatever attack might have been planned on the Zaporozhzhye nuclear power plant. But anyway, putting all that aside, an attack on the Zaporozhzhye nuclear power plant would require massive strikes by multiple missiles hitting essentially the same locations in the nuclear power plant repeatedly before any particular or significant damage were done. At least that would be the case with the kind of missiles that Ukraine possesses, Tochka-U's and Storm Shadows and that kind of thing. It would require either a vast cascade of missiles, which Ukraine doesn't have, or exceptionally powerful missiles, far more powerful, again, than those which Ukraine has, to cause any real damage to a power plant like this. So, having said that, that might argue against an attack, Ukraine planning some kind of attack on the power plant itself. But I am very, very sorry to say that the possibility of Ukraine launching an attack, perhaps with some kind of radioactive device or bomb, in order or missile warhead, such as that Russian official was talking about, in order to simulate some kind of event at the nuclear power plant. I'm afraid I can't completely exclude that. Ukraine has shelled the Zaporozhzhye nuclear power plant in the past. This has been acknowledged by US officials indirectly through articles which have appeared in both the Washington Post and the New York Times. Ukraine has made lots of threats or warnings or given warnings which to me sometimes look like threats about the Zaporozhzhye nuclear power plant. They seem to have this Zaporozhzhye nuclear power plant very much on their mind. I discussed about 2 days ago in a video that I did how it seems that there are some people in Russia who believe that the Zaporozhzhye nuclear power plant had some possible role in a Ukrainian nuclear weapons program, something which I want to reiterate again, I cannot confirm, and which I treat as a rumor rather than a fact. But anyway, the Ukrainians do seem to be obsessively focused on this nuclear power plant. They've been talking about it incessantly. And I can't discount the possibility that some reckless people within the Ukrainian political and military system might be prepared to do some kind of strike against the nuclear power plant, perhaps in order to simulate some kind of nuclear incident, which they would then try to blame on Russia. To those who say that this is far-fetched, I would point out that the United States has already made clear its own concerns, or shall we say its own distancing from Ukrainian activities, which it considers or claims it considers reckless and irresponsible. The United States says that Ukraine was responsible for the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines. The United States has acknowledged that Ukraine was responsible for the attack on the Kerch Bridge. The United States has acknowledged that Ukraine was responsible for the assassinations of people like Daria Dugina and Vladlen Tatarsky in Russia. And the United States has made it fairly clear that it disapproves, or says it disapproves, of the Ukrainian insertions into pre-1991 Russia, if I can call it that, with the cross-border raids into Belgorod and all of those places. Now, I say that the United States says that it disapproves of all of these things. It's important to make clear that there's been no official statement about them from the US government. We are reliant again on our old friends, the anonymous sources, speaking for the US government, planting stories in the New York Times and the Washington Post and those sort of places. But there's no doubt at all that these stories that have been planted by the United States have official sanction, and we see that the United States is in effect itself telling us that Ukraine is capable of behaving in reckless and irresponsible ways. So if the United States thinks that, if the pattern of Ukrainian behavior confirms that, how can one say with any degree of confidence that Ukraine might not try to carry out some kind of incident at the Zaporozhzhye nuclear power plant? What about the other side? What about the Russians? Well, the International Atomic Energy Agency has said that as far as they could see, they have seen no evidence of any mining or explosives being planted by Russia on the territory of the Zaporozhzhye nuclear power plant. Now, IAEA officials, including Mr. Grossi, the president of the IAEA, when they say this, always are extremely careful to leave themselves openings. Probably they know that if an incident does take place at the Zaporozhzhye nuclear power plant, the reaction in the West will almost invariably be to blame the Russians for it. So they don't want to be put in a position where, in anticipation of such an event, where they are appearing to side with the Russians against the West and, of course, Ukraine as well. So they qualify their denials by engaging in weak and somewhat vague words. But nonetheless, and for what it's worth, and I think it's worth an awful lot, by the way, the IAEA has its people at the Zaporozhzhye nuclear power plant, and they're saying straightforwardly that they have seen nothing. They have seen nothing of any sort of preparations by the Russians to blow the whole structure up. And of course, the other big question is, and this is one which I come back to many times, why would the Russians want to do this thing? As has been pointed out by many people, if there was radioactive contamination as a result of an incident at the Zaporozhzhye nuclear power plant, it would affect territories Russia controls at least as much and probably more than it would affect territories controlled by Ukraine. And given that Ukraine's offensive is at a complete standstill and that the balance of military advantage on the battlefields has been shifting decisively in Russia's favor over the last few weeks, why would the Russians engage in an utterly reckless and irresponsible incident of this kind? What would they conceivably gain by it? Obviously, they would blame it on Ukraine, but they would know in advance that Western governments would be almost certain to blame it on them, on the Russians, and of course, Western governments would unquestionably blame it on the Russians if it were the Russians who had actually done this thing. So I have to say this, I've explained my thinking here at some length. I think that, as with all these other incidents, If anything happens, it seems to me that the weight of evidence up to this point, circumstantial, but nonetheless, the heavy weight of evidence suggests that it is much more likely that it would be Ukraine that would be responsible than that it would be Russia. Of course, this is before any incident has taken place. Perhaps over the course of the incident itself, assuming it happens, which I pray it doesn't, well, it might be that in that case, new information does come to light, which points to a different conclusion. But I've stated my own thinking and reasoning about this up to this point, and for the moment, I'm going to stick with it. I see no reason not to. Anyway, there we are. Nothing happened over the course of last night. Now, that could be because, in fact, nobody has any plans to do anything to the Zaporozhzhye nuclear power plant, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Or it could be because perhaps Ukraine did, and that they were leaned on by these European leaders who were supposedly on the phones to Kiev over the course of yesterday and last night. Who's to say? I don't think one should discount the possibility that nobody has any plans at all relating to any actual incident at the Zaporozhzhye nuclear power plant. I'm going to say straight away that the idea of simulating an incident at the nuclear power plant, launching a missile, succession of missiles with some kind of, well, presumably radioactive or dirty warhead in it. It would not be very radioactive, by the way, or so I understand. And pretending that this was somehow part of an explosion triggered by the Russians as a result of all these mines that the Russians are supposed to have placed on the roof of this power station. Well, I have to say this all seems very, very complicated and very difficult to carry out in practice. And even if one allows for Western biases in favour of Ukraine, I think it might be a bit of a stretch to persuade most of the international community that this was a genuine bona fide accident carried or incident orchestrated by the Russians as opposed to Ukraine. So it may be that the Ukrainians don't actually have any plans with respect to the nuclear power plant. They've tried several times to recapture it. They sent raiding parties across the Kakhovka reservoir in the past. When that happened, by the way, in the autumn, initially, I was actually skeptical about those stories that the Russians were circulating, that there'd been Ukrainian raiding parties sent across the Kakhovka reservoir to try to storm and recapture the nuclear power plant. It all seemed to me slightly crazy to try and do things like this. All of those attacks were repelled, and of course, many, many months later, just a few weeks ago, in fact, we finally got confirmation in the Western media that these attacks had indeed taken place, just as the Russians said, and that, in fact, these raiding parties had been systematically destroyed, put out of action by the Russians, who have a well-organized defensive system around the Zaporozhzhye nuclear power station. So that those attempts failed. I've discussed the difficulties, in my opinion, my own personal opinion, that Ukraine would have to try and send a raiding party by foot across the largely drained Kakhovka reservoir. I think that especially trying to do that at night would be extremely difficult. There would be no cover. Troops moving across the reservoir would be easily detected by Russian drones with night vision devices, of which we must assume they are patrolling this reservoir area all the time. And of course, there are other detection systems that exist. I know, for example, that there are acoustic detectors as well in existence, which could probably pick up the noise of movements, and I suspect again that the Russians have planted those in abundance. I said that the reservoir, the soil of the reservoir, is unlikely to be fully dry, and I understand, by the way, that the conditions in this part of Ukraine have been very rainy over these last few days, weeks even, which makes it even less plausible that the surface area of the reservoir has dried out. I said that almost certainly precludes any idea of sending heavy vehicles across the reservoir, so one would be reduced to trying to send light infantry across the reservoir on foot without cover, exposed to Russian artillery and machine gun fire. And I've also said that even allowing for the fact that the reservoir itself would have had shallow banks, there would still be banks over which those troops, those Ukrainian troops, would have to climb in order to get out of the reservoir and to reach the nuclear power station. And that would also make them extremely vulnerable as targets. So I think that the problems of storming the Zaporozhzhye nuclear power plant are probably as great as they have ever been. They might even be greater than they were in the autumn when Ukraine tried to storm it. So, in summary, it's possible that the Ukrainians understand that they can't recapture the Zaporozhzhye nuclear power plant, and it's also possible that they've realized that they cannot do it much in the way of damage through missile attacks and shelling, such as might cause an actual damage to the plant, which could cause a real accident. And I've also said that this elaborate concept of lobbing a missile with a radioactive warhead or dirty warhead and trying to pass this off as some kind of Russian attack might be just too complicated to be convincing, even for those structurally biased to believe what Ukraine says. So it could be that Ukraine has no real plans against the nuclear power plant at all. It could be that this whole affair is simply part of Ukraine's effort to keep the issue of the nuclear power plant continuously alive, to play it up constantly in order to create a source of concern, of international tension between Russia and the West. It might be that from a Ukrainian point of view, this is an attempt to keep the Russians continuously on the back foot in propaganda and presentational terms. I don't think that is a possibility that can be excluded entirely. But I have to say that Ukrainian statements over the last few days have reached a pitch of intensity which perhaps argues against that theory and does make me wonder whether something related to the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant was indeed intended or planned, but not so far carried out. Well, if that is so, then I'm sorry to say that we're not out of the danger period. Maybe no attack happened yesterday because the attack has not yet been made ready. Maybe the plan was not to launch an attack yesterday at all, but to launch this attack on some other day, and that all these rumors that we were hearing were intended to keep the Russians tense, and then when the attack failed to happen, to cause them to relax, thereby making it easier to take them off their guard when the attack does eventually come. Whatever, this remains a troubling and worrying affair. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. But I am sure that it is one of those issues that must be concerning Russian planners, Russian military and political leaders a lot, and they must be acutely concerned and spending an enormous amount of time talking to each other and debating what Ukraine really intends to do and when the strike against the nuclear power plant might actually come. Anyway, that's all I will say for the moment, but as I said, because there was nothing happened last night, I'm afraid it doesn't mean that nothing is going to happen. We'll just have to wait and see. Now, in the meantime, as I said at the start of this program, the fact that we are in what is referred to as a relative lull in the fighting, by which all I mean is that Ukraine has not been trying, or rather has been trying, but without much conviction, to launch attacks on the Zaporozhzhye front lines, but failing to break through. Anyway, notwithstanding all of that, there was fighting yesterday, and the fighting, the main focus of Ukraine's attacks has been in the Bakhmut area. And in fact, over the course of last night, there was a report which has since been denied, and it seems conclusively denied, that the Ukrainians had succeeded in recapturing the village of Klesheyevka, which is to the southwest, to the south of Artyomsk, the former Bakhmut, and which is one of the villages which was captured by the Wagner organization in the weeks leading up to Bakhmut's eventual fall. Well, it's now conclusively established that Klesheyevka remains under Russian control, but it does seem that there was a very heavy Ukrainian attack in that direction yesterday. The Russians were able to push it back. Apparently, Ukraine suffered very heavy losses. Russian Ministry of Defense is talking about the Ukrainians having been thrown back to their starting lines, which might be an overstatement of events. But anyway, that, it seems, was the major focus of Ukraine's attacks. And I'm going to say straight away that I think that having failed in the Zaporozhye and southern Donbass front lines, Ukraine has managed to gain control of some amount of territory on the Vremevka ledge, but they've still not managed to capture all of it. The attacks south of Orekhov have been a complete failure. The attacks south of, towards Pyatikhatki have also achieved nothing. The cross-border raid close to the Antonovsky Bridge, the establishment by Ukraine for about a week of a tiny bridgehead under the Antonovsky Bridge, the remaining parts of the Antonovsky Bridge on the left bank of the Dnieper, apparently on an island there. Well, that has been conclusively repulsed and destroyed. And in fact, yesterday we got pictures of Russian shelling and attacks on Ukrainian positions on the right bank, the western bank of the Dnieper, near the Antonovsky Bridge, the place, in other words, from which those raiding parties launched their attack and briefly seized that bridgehead. Anyway, with all of the attacks there repelled, it seems that Ukraine, its primary focus at the moment, is to try to break through in the Bakhmut area, to capture at least some of the villages there, perhaps ultimately to break the flanks around Bakhmut, or rather Artyomsk as it now is, perhaps to encircle Artyomsk, perhaps to force the Russians to pull out of Artyomsk, this town that the Wagner organization captured after this intense fighting that ended with the capture of Artyomsk, Bakhmut, on the 20th of May. And in some ways it makes sense, because this is precisely the area where in some respects the Russian defenses are weakest. The major Russian fortified lines in this area are to the east of Bakhmut, between Bakhmut, Artyomsk, and Popasnaya. And I think that this is the strongest evidence, by the way, that what none other than Yevgeny Prigozhin formally has told us, that the original plan devised by General Surovikin in October was not to capture Bakhmut, but to use Bakhmut to bleed Ukraine dry. That was the original plan, and that in fact what happened was that in the end, Prigozhin and the Wagner group exceeded their instructions and went beyond what they had been told to do and pressed forward with the advance in Bakhmut, culminating in the capture of the entire town. Now, as I said, that was not my impression at the time. I felt back in the winter that the Russians most definitely did want to take Bakhmut, but an accumulation of evidence has now come to light which points clearly and very strongly to a Russian plan to use Bakhmut as a place to bleed Ukraine, a meat grinder, not to capture the place itself. For a full, informed analysis and explanation of Russian thinking, and for the effects of Prigozhin's insubordination and the consequences that it created for the Russian military command, I would refer you to the live stream that we did yesterday on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I, with Andrei Martyanov, in which Andrei explains very clearly Russian thinking and why Prigozhin's and Wagner's decision to exceed their commands, to go beyond their orders and to capture the entire town, actually in some ways unbalanced the entire Russian military approach in the winter and spring until Bakhmut itself was captured. But anyway, putting all that aside, and I appreciate that there are some people who are going to push back against all of this, putting all that aside, it's important to say that with Bakhmut having fallen on the 20th of May, with the Russians having only recently captured Artyomsk itself, the Russians have not had the time to create fortified lines west of Bakhmut, securing their control of the town, nor have they had the time or the resources to capture places like Khromovo or Ivanivska to the west of the former Bakhmut. And that has left Russian positions in Artyomsk, in Bakhmut, and in the villages around more vulnerable than they are in other locations. So it makes sense for Ukraine to shift the weight of its offensive to this area. And the last couple of days, which have been marked by heavy rain, which has affected the operation of the Russian Air Force, which has been a major decisive advantage that the Russians have had in this conflict, well, all of that explains why, as I said, it makes sense for the Ukrainians to try to focus their advance, their attack in this particular area. And it is clear that they have made some gains. They've been able to gain some ground around Artyomsk, especially in the southwest. North of Artyomivsk, they have apparently been largely unsuccessful, but to the south of Artyomivsk, they have been able to press hard on Russian positions in Klesheyevka and Kordyumovka, but up to this point, they have not captured either of these places. And a report from the Russian Defense Ministry that I saw just a short time ago suggested that the entire Ukrainian attack, the latest Ukrainian attack on Klesheyevka, has failed. So that is now the main focus of Ukraine's offensive. In a strange way, it's as if the Battle of Bakhmut never really ended. The Russians captured the place on the 20th of May. The Ukrainians somehow inexorably get drawn back. They can't leave Bakhmut alone, despite the comments and statements of many Ukrainian officials, or I should say former officials, despite the claims and statements of many Western officials that Bakhmut isn't worth all the cost in lives. Ukrainians are drawn inexorably back to this town where they've suffered all these immense losses, and they are as if compelled to try to continue this battle even after, in effect, it was lost. Now, elsewhere on the front lines, in the area of Kremenaya, Sviatovo, and first and foremost Kupiansk, it's clear that the advantage is now passing to the Russians. And what we've heard, the latest reports suggest, and these are coming from Ukraine now, that the Russian concentrations in this area are enormous, that there's hundreds of thousands of Russian troops starting to gather in this area to the north, in around Kharkiv region. And incidentally, and for the record, the Russian Defense Ministry has now said that the pattern of volunteering in Russia, men coming forward to serve in the military and to participate in the special military operation, has been unaffected by the Prigozhin affair. It didn't result in men, principally I suspect young men, feeling deterred from joining the Russian military. Apparently the number of volunteers that the Russian military is now inducting now comes to 1,400 a day. So we see that the Russian military continues to expand, as apparently very large forces, I discussed this all yesterday, 2 tank divisions, an army corps, which one must presume now have completed their training. Shoigu reported to Putin that this would all be completed by the end of June. Their training would be completed by the end of June. We're now in July. So all these enormous forces are gathering, apparently, in the northern part of the battlefronts. The Russians are said to have around 50,000 troops around in the Bakhmut area. Apparently their forces in the south, in Zaporozhzhye and Kherson region, number around 80,000. We're talking allegedly of 180,000 in northern Donbass and this part of the conflict area, with heavy concentrations of troops and tanks and other machines starting to gather on the Russian side of the border. Now, what are the Russians going to do with all of these forces? The answer is I have absolutely no idea. Whether they are a reserve intended to be used to plug any holes in the Donbass, which is not possible. Maybe that's the plan. But if they are indeed located in this part of the conflict zone, then presumably the Russians have some plans for them. And it could be, as I've said in the past, that with Russian forces now advancing towards Kupiansk, the Russians might be intending some sort of big return to Kharkiv region, some major advance towards Slavyansk in the north, perhaps also finally tidying up the unfinished business from last summer, capturing places like Siversk, ending the threats to the central and northern Donbass once and for all. Now, all of this information about these gathering Russian forces does call into question some points that Alexei Danilov, the very hardline secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, has now been making. He's come out and said that at this stage of Ukraine's offensive, the plan is not to break through or capture territory, it is to inflict severe losses on the Russians, to severely deplete Russian forces, and that the main offensive, the real offensive, will only happen once the Russian forces have been depleted in this way. Now, this, on its face, assuming that the information that I'm getting from the battlefronts is true, and I've discussed how it's been essentially confirmed by Western reporting. We had that article in Forbes about the disaster Ukraine suffered on the 8th of June, south of Orekhov, losing 25 tanks in just 2 hours. We've seen that article by Richard Kemp in the Daily Telegraph that I discussed recently about how Ukraine has failed to gain much territory but has suffered heavy losses in men and machines. Well, that stands it all on its head if we believe Danilov. It is not Ukraine that's suffering the big losses, it is Russia. Now, as I said, that doesn't make any kind of sense to me. We've already seen an accumulation of evidence that it is indeed Ukraine that is suffering much heavier losses than the Russians. Now, what the exact proportion, relation of losses is between the two sides is difficult to say. Professor Mearsheimer has calculated that it's 2 to 1, 2 Ukrainians for every Russian. Others think it's much more likely that its Ukrainian losses are much greater than the disproportion is much greater than that. Martyanov yesterday in our live stream said that in many places it's more like 10 to 1, and in some particular battles it's even up to 17 to 1, which would be staggering if it could be proved to be true. I'm not saying it's not true, by the way. But the accumulation of evidence from informed observers most emphatically suggests that it is Ukraine that is suffering the greater manpower losses. And we've been seeing these protests in Ukrainian cities that speak of Ukrainians actually saying that cemeteries need to be increased in size because there is insufficient room for them. One of the saddest things about the war that I've seen up to this point. And we also see the evidence from Ukraine's increasingly pressing mobilization of men, the way in which Ukraine seems to be diluting continuously the eligibility criteria for men who are being drafted into the battle, the way in which mobilization, conscripting of men, is now expanding increasingly in the western regions of Ukraine and in other places, the way in which Ukraine seems to be in effect close to a kind of general mobilization of what manpower reserves it has left, all of which I find dismal, but which again contrasts with the way in which Russia says it doesn't need to carry out a mobilization because so many men on the Russian side are coming forward voluntarily to participate in this war, so that the need for mobilization, a formal mobilization, does not exist. And I would add, by the way, that one particular Ukrainian channel, I think it was Resident, but there are several of them, even said that volunteering by Ukrainian men to join the Ukrainian army has fallen to its lowest level since the conflict began. Whereas in February and March 2022, lots of men voluntarily came to enlist into the Ukrainian army. The days of that have apparently passed. So Danilov's comments in terms of human resources, which is what an army needs in order to wage war, single most important part of any military is trained manpower. All the evidence suggests that they're depleting faster than the Russian. And in terms of equipment, well, it's the same. And I would add that even as Ukraine now appears to be trying to hold back its remaining Western tanks, its Leopard 2s, the remaining Leopard 2s that it still has, its Challenger 2s that it still has and hasn't yet committed to the battle, it continues to lose Bradleys. There's been attacks with Bradleys in various parts of the battlefronts. Photographs have appeared of burnt-out Bradleys, which appear to be recent pictures. They're not from the earlier fighting at the beginning of June. And the Russian Ministry of Defense is reporting the destruction of Bradleys. I think, by the way, this war, this conflict, has probably been the graveyard of the Bradley's reputation as an infantry fighting vehicle. And I want to be very careful here about what I mean by this. I don't mean that it is a bad infantry fighting vehicle, that it is less good, for example, than the Soviet-era infantry fighting vehicles that the Ukrainians used to have. And I certainly am not suggesting that it is a worse infantry fighting vehicle than the Russian BMP-3M, which is increasingly becoming the most important infantry fighting vehicle used by the Russian army. I'm simply saying that the Bradley came to this conflict with a reputation as being the Rolls-Royce of infantry fighting vehicles, the best one around. And this is largely an image promoted by its very successful use by the United States during the fighting against Iraq, especially the fighting in 1991. And this, despite the fact that there was multiple warnings before the Bradleys were supplied to Ukraine, and this is a complex and difficult machine to operate, that the Ukrainians would need a very high level of advanced training over many months to acquire proficiency in its use, and that the vehicle itself was not without flaws. But in the general praise of this machine, this infantry fighting vehicle, all those warnings were disregarded, as they were disregarded also about the Leopard 2. I remember reading reports in the Financial Times, of all places, which comparing the Soviet-era tanks which Ukraine was using with the Western tanks, the Leopard 2s and the Challenger 2s, which in the winter the West committed itself to supply, it actually said that it would be like Ukraine shifting from 1950s vintage motor cars to modern sports cars. That was supposed to be the level of difference. Only it has turned out otherwise. Now, even allowing for the problems with training and things of that kind, it's now clear that Leopard 2s and especially Bradleys are as vulnerable to destruction on the battlefields as any other armoured vehicle, Soviet, Western, or otherwise. And as I've said already, I think the Bradley's reputation as an indestructible super vehicle, which to my knowledge some people did believe. I've had some exchanges with some people who said that there was no comparison between the excellence of the Bradley and the kind of systems that the Russians were working with. Well, I think across the world, this image, this belief has now been blown away. And I'm going to add that I think that this is also having an effect on thinking in the West about supplying Ukraine with other Western weapons. It's been interesting how, since the offensive got underway, enthusiasm for supplying Ukraine with F16s appears to have cooled. There was even a report on a Russian Telegram channel, I believe it was Intel Slava, which suggested that there's some word now that the actual supply of F16s to Ukraine might be postponed all the way back to 2025. But the point that's being made is that with the Bradley's reputation so badly damaged by all these pictures of blown out and burning Bradleys on the steppe land of southern Ukraine, or Western Russia if you prefer, if you take a Russian view. Well, all of these pictures, the West is not keen on seeing the same thing happen with the F-16, which, as I understand it, remains a major export item for the US military-industrial complex. They do not want to see the F-16's reputation destroyed in the same way as the reputation of the Bradleys has been. So, there we go. By the way, it is not just the Bradleys' reputation that has been damaged. In the run-up to all of these deliveries of Western weapons to Ukraine, I made a number of rather strong comments about the French wheeled tank, the AMX-10RC. I said that it didn't seem to me to be any sort of tank at all. I was skeptical that it was in any way suitable for use in this conflict. I said that the gun was low-powered and light and would certainly not be effective against Russian armor. Also, it was not stabilized, which meant that the AMX-10RC would have to stop in order to fire its gun. I said that the armor appeared to be very thin. I said that the fact that it was a wheeled vehicle might make it a problematic vehicle to operate in these particular conditions. And I said that everything about this particular vehicle pointed to it having been developed by the French as part of their operations in northwest Africa, where France continues to exercise a predominant geopolitical influence, and where French troops have often engaged in policing operations against local insurgent groups. And that this might be a very suitable and relatively cheap and effective vehicle for that kind of war, but that it was not really the sort of vehicle what anyone would want to supply to Ukraine in the kind of conflict in which it now finds itself up against the Russian army. And so it has proved. There's now been statements, a cascade of statements appearing in the Western media about how the Ukrainians consider the AMX-10RC to be useless and dangerous to themselves. I get the sense that it's been taken out of the battle lines. I get the sense that the Ukrainian operators of these machines see them as a death trap and don't want to go into battle with them. And though I'm not exactly sure how many of these machines have been destroyed, I gather that a significant proportion of the 30 or 40 which were delivered have been destroyed. And as I said, I understand that most of them have been taken out of service on the front lines. So that was an ill-conceived supply of a so-called wheeled tank to Ukraine, which was not a tank at all. And inevitably, again, France's reputation, the reputation of France as a weapons exporter, has taken a knock. I would say that the decision to supply these particular vehicles to Ukraine, I find it, on the face of it, so strange that I do wonder what the thinking behind it could possibly have been. Anyway, that's where we are with the offensive at the moment. Major attempts by Ukraine to achieve at least some kind of advance in the Bakhmut area at the moment, not succeeding in doing so, but at least, as I said, this is a vulnerable point in the Russian defences. And I suspect that the Russian General Staff are frustrated and angry that they have to defend positions in this area which they never particularly expected or wanted to occupy in the first place. Total failure by Ukraine in the areas that really matter, in the south, in Zaporozhzhye, Kherson, southern Donbass region, and big Russian advances. Well, Russian advances in the north, and a very apparently growing rumours of a very big build-up there, and a steady accumulating build-up of Russian military power on behind the front lines, new Russian divisions, not just brigades, but entire divisions being created, vast numbers of tanks and other machines being deployed to the battlefronts. Now, that then brings us back to the economic war. There's been a lot of speculation, again, about Russian endurance in this war, and it remains an article of faith with some people that sooner or later Russia is going to run out of money, not going to be able to sustain the war effort, that the huge spurt in arms production that we are seeing is unsustainable and will end. And there's been another brief blip of this coming from the fact that the Russian trade surplus significantly fell in the first and probably the second quarters of this year, first half of this year, and that the Russian current account surplus has also fallen. In fact, it's almost in balance. It's rather than achieving a surplus. And a lot of people seem to think that this is going to jeopardize Russia's military position overall. I'm going to say straight away that all of this is emphatically and certainly wrong. There's been a meeting in Russia where the economics officials, led by Prime Minister Mishustin, have now reported to President Putin. And Mishustin has said that unemployment in Russia is at a record low, around 3%. He has reported an increase in headline inflation rates from around 2.5% to about 3.5%. In my opinion, this is entirely a statistical shift. It's widely expected. And of course, 3.5% inflation is very low historically by Russian standards. And it's likely that the inflation rate will probably start to fall back again in the late summer, as it usually does in Russia. But perhaps the single most interesting fact that Mishustin said is that industrial production, economic activity within Russia itself, is continuing to surge. In the first half of the year, the economy grew by 0.6% overall. Economic activity year on year expanded by 5.4% in May, which is close to boom levels. And Mishustin said that the government is now confident that, bar unexpected factors, growth this year, GDP growth, will be well over 2%, which is more than double. In fact, it's 3 times better than what the IMF was predicting at the start of this year. Now, of course, growth rate of 2%, I mean, it's not stellar growth. It's not the kind of growth that Russia was achieving, for example, in the first decade of this century, when growth rates, average annual growth rates, were around 7% a year. But it would be enough to erase the entire contraction caused by the sanctions last year. And of course, Russia remains heavily sanctioned. But going back to the issues about the trade surplus and the current account surplus that's attracted so much attention, and which, by the way, are the reason for the decline in the value of the ruble against the dollar. Why the ruble has fallen against the dollar and the euro, it's purely a reflection of trade dynamics. Well, the reason for this, of course, is connected to the very steep fall in energy prices, oil and gas prices, that has taken place globally since the second half of last year. And whereas oil and gas prices were very high at the start of last year, oil and gas prices are much lower, significantly lower now. And that, of course, has affected the Russian trade surplus, because Russia's major exports continue to be energy products. And of course, that has also had an effect on the current account surplus as well. Now, the point to understand about this is that a few years ago, if energy prices had fallen in the way that they've just done, we would not have had a surge in growth in Russia. We would have had a recession, because at that time, the energy complex was such an important part of the whole economy that a decline in the price of oil and gas would inevitably have resulted in investment cutbacks right across the entire Russian economy, and that would in turn almost certainly have led to a contraction. This is the first year I know in which the Russian economy is growing against a backdrop of falling energy prices. Now, that is not completely unexpected to me. I've been saying for years that the extent of Russia's dependence on energy exports is being overstated, that the Russian economy has, over the last decade or so, achieved levels of stability and critical mass, which means that it's become less tied in with energy exports than it once was. The economy is far more diversified than it used to be. Sources of funding and revenue are far more diversified than they used to be. And we're now starting to see this. And we're not only starting to see this as well, but of course, economic activity is becoming self-generating within Russia itself, which argues increasingly for some kind of what economists sometimes refer to as virtuous circle starting to take hold. So, given all of this, I think that given all these realities, it again shows the misconception behind the sanctions, the failure to understand the extent to which the Russian economy has developed and grown over the last 10 or so years in Russia, and it suggests further economic resilience. Now, undoubtedly, higher defense spending is playing some role in all of this. But, as has also already been pointed out by certain economic commentators in the West, the proportion of GDP that Russia is committing to its defense effort, which isn't only, by the way, about the war in Ukraine, it is for the totality of its armed forces. The proportion that defense is absorbing in terms of GDP is around 3% of GDP, remains at around 3% of GDP. Perhaps it's gone a bit higher than that, but probably not by very much. So yes, higher defense spending is probably stimulating the economy to some extent, but everything points to the fact that the achievement of macroeconomic stability, the overall fall in inflation, and above all, the reduction in interest rates, which has been, in my opinion, high interest rates have been, in my opinion, the single biggest drag on the Russian economy for the better part of a decade. The fall in interest rates is setting the scene for economic growth this year, and conceivably, in time, an economic boom. My opinion, the one thing that might throw all of this into disarray is if the central bank starts to become excessively concerned about inflation rises, of which there is little real sign at the moment, and starts reversing its interest rate reduction policy. If it reverts to the extremely tough interest rate policies, monetary policies that it was conducting in the post-2014 period, when for a time Russia had positive interest rates above inflation of around 5%, and went on doing so year after year in ways that, in my opinion, stifled economic growth and investment. I hope that the central bank, I expect that the central bank now understands that the need for that has gone, that years of tough monetary policy have achieved their effect, that inflation in Russia has now been brought under control and that Russia can transition towards a more relaxed interest rate regime, a more relaxed monetary policy. I'm not suggesting anything like QE or negative interest rates or any of those things, but a softer monetary policy than in the past, in which case there is no reason why economic growth should not continue against a background of reduced inflation, making it relatively straightforward for Russia not only to continue to fund the war and produce the weapons that it needs, but to continue to improve and upgrade its living standards. Well, that's me for the day. More from me soon. This is my opportunity to again wish you all a very good day, and to remind you that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video, and you can also check out our shop, get yourself the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those great things. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again, and have a very good day, and more from me soon.